At first glance, an armored train looks like something out of a different era. Steel plates, cannons mounted on railway platforms, soldiers firing from behind narrow slits. It feels outdated, almost primitive. But that impression is misleading, because armored trains are not just a weapon. They are an idea that has appeared again and again, from the 19th century to the modern nuclear age. And every time it was born from the same question: what happens if you combine mobility with heavy firepower, using the infrastructure that already exists? The story begins during the American Civil War, where first real appearance of the armored train concept is often linked to a man whose background already explains a lot. John Basil Turchin, born as Ivan Turchaninov, was not just a Union officer during the American Civil War. He was a trained military engineer from the Russian Empire, a man who thought in terms of systems, logistics, and movement. And that matters, because the idea of an armored train didn't come from abstract theory. It came from a very practical problem. Railroads had become the arteries of the war. They carried troops, ammunition, food, everything an army needed to function. But they were also vulnerable. Tracks could be sabotaged, trains could be ambushed, supply lines could be cut with relatively small forces. And this created a new kind of battlefield, one not defined by front lines, but by control of movement. Turchin understood this earlier than most. Instead of treating trains as something that needed protection, he turned them into the protection itself. The solution was simple, almost obvious in hindsight. Take a train, reinforce it, place soldiers and artillery on board, and use it not just to transport troops, but to actively fight along the railway. These early armored trains were extremely crude. Flat cars were covered with timber, sometimes layered with iron plates when available. Open platforms carried cannons or mortars. Infantry rode inside, ready to deploy at any point along the track. There was no standardized design, no doctrine, no real precedent, but there was a clear idea: mobility plus firepower, constrained but fast. And in the context of the Civil War, that combination was powerful. Railways allowed rapid movement across large distances, far faster than marching troops. And now, that movement could be accompanied by immediate combat capability. Instead of arriving at the battlefield, the train became the battlefield. Turchin and others used such trains for fire support for troops, protection of cities and stations, rapid strikes, and protection of supply lines. They could respond quickly to threats, reinforce positions, and project force along critical routes. But the limitations were already visible. The train could not leave the tracks. It depended entirely on the integrity of the railway. A destroyed bridge or a section of rail could stop it completely. Even so, the concept proved something important. It showed that infrastructure itself could be weaponized, that movement systems, railways in this case, could be turned into platforms of war, not just support for it. And that idea would not disappear. It returned later on the sundown of century, during the Second Boer War in South Africa, and the conditions here explain why the concept returned. Unlike the dense and relatively developed regions of the United States, South Africa presented a different challenge: vast distances, sparse infrastructure, limited roads. But there was one critical element: railways. The British Empire had invested heavily in railway construction across the region, primarily to support logistics, troop movement, and control over territory. These rail lines became the backbone of British military operations. And just like before, that created a problem. If railways are the backbone, then they become the primary target. Boer forces, highly mobile and familiar with the terrain, relied on guerrilla tactics. They avoided large-scale battles and instead focused on disrupting British supply lines, sabotaging rails, ambushing trains, cutting communication. This is where armored trains returned, not as an experiment, but as a response to a specific tactical threat. The British began to deploy trains equipped with armored plating, artillery, and infantry detachments. But unlike the crude platforms of the Civil War, these were already more refined. Armored wagons were purpose-built. Guns were placed with better fields of fire. Troops were integrated into the structure of the train. In some cases, locomotives themselves were partially armored, and entire train compositions were designed for combat roles. The mission was clear: patrol railway lines, escort supply trains, respond quickly to attacks, and project force along the rail network. One of the most well-known incidents involving such a train was the ambush near Shively, where a British armored train carrying, among others, a young Winston Churchill, was attacked by Boer forces. The event itself illustrates both the strength and the weakness of the concept. The train provided mobility and firepower, but once the tracks were blocked or damaged, it became trapped. Exactly the same limitation, but now in a more developed form. Compared to the early experiments associated with John Basil Turchin, the Boer War shows a clear evolution. In the Civil War, armored trains were improvised, built from available materials used opportunistically. In the Boer War, they became standardized, integrated into military planning, and used systematically thriving. But more importantly, their role changed. Earlier, they were tools of opportunity, a way to add firepower to mobility. Now they became tools of control over territory, control over infrastructure, control over logistics. And this shift matters. Because from this point on, armored trains were no longer just an experiment. They were recognized as a legitimate military solution, with clearly defined strengths and equally clear limitations. And those limitations would only become more important in the wars to come. By the time of World War I, warfare had changed completely. This was no longer a war of movement. It was a war of industry, mass armies, heavy artillery, and endless supply chains. In this environment, railways became not just important, but absolutely essential. Every shell, every rifle, every reinforcement moved along rails. And because of that, armored trains evolved again, not simply as a result of innovation, but because the war itself demanded it. On the Western Front, however, armored trains quickly reached their limits. The war here became static. Continuous trench lines stretched for hundreds of kilometers, reinforced with dense fortifications, barbed wire, and constant artillery fire. There was almost no space for maneuver. Railways still existed, but they were under constant observation, within artillery range, and frequently destroyed. In such conditions, armored trains had only limited use. They could support rear areas, transport troops, and occasionally provide artillery fire, but they could not influence the front line in any decisive way. The battlefield was simply too dense and too static. The situation was completely different on the Eastern Front. Here, the war remained far more fluid. Front lines were unstable, distances were enormous, and infrastructure was less developed. These conditions created an ideal environment for armored trains. They could move quickly across vast territories, reinforce collapsing sectors, support advancing units, and operate in regions where roads were nearly useless. In this context, armored trains became something much closer to mobile artillery platforms. Heavily armed, relatively protected, and capable of concentrating firepower rapidly along key rail lines. Russia, Germany, and Austria-Hungary all used them extensively, and for the first time, they were produced in more standardized forms. By this stage, armored trains were no longer improvised machines. They incorporated many elements of modern industrial warfare. Fully armored wagons, rotating gun turrets, dedicated artillery platforms, anti-aircraft weapons, and improved communication systems became common features. In some designs, one can already see parallels with early tanks, enclosed armor, defined firing sectors, and integration of multiple weapon systems. The difference, however, remained fundamental. Tanks brought firepower off the rails, while armored trains concentrated it along them. After the collapse of the Russian Empire, during the Russian Civil War, armored trains reached their absolute peak. This conflict created the perfect conditions for their use: vast territories, fragmented fronts, limited road networks, and an extreme dependence on railways. Armored trains became not just support units, but central elements of warfare. Entire operations were built around them. They functioned as command centers, artillery batteries, transport hubs, and even symbols of power. Some trains were effectively moving fortresses, carrying infantry, artillery, and supplies within a single system. Control of railways often meant control of entire regions. In many cases, battles were decided not by who held the ground, but by who controlled the tracks. Compared to earlier conflicts like the Boer War, this represents another major shift. Armored trains were no longer simply patrol tools or defensive platforms. They became fully integrated into industrial-scale warfare. Their evolution followed the same pattern as the war itself: more armor, more firepower, more specialization, and deeper integration into military systems. But at the same time, a new competitor had appeared: the tank. Unlike armored trains, tanks were not tied to infrastructure. They could cross terrain, bypass obstacles, and operate independently. And this introduced a fundamental question. If firepower can be brought anywhere, why limit it to rails? From this moment on, armored trains would always exist in comparison to something more flexible. They would continue to evolve, but their role would never be the same again. By the time of World War II, the battlefield had changed once again. Tanks had become a dominant force, capable of moving across terrain, breaking through defenses, and operating independently of infrastructure. At first glance, this should have made armored trains obsolete. And yet, they did not disappear. The reason is simple. Tanks replaced armored trains in one role, but not in all of them. Because the core function of an armored train was never just combat. It was control of infrastructure. World War II was fought across enormous distances, especially on the Eastern Front. Supply lines stretched for hundreds and sometimes thousands of kilometers. Railways remained the primary means of transporting fuel, ammunition, reinforcements, and equipment. And wherever railways existed, the same vulnerability remained. Tracks could be sabotaged, bridges could be destroyed, supply trains could be ambushed. This is why armored trains continued to be used, not as frontline breakthrough weapons, but as tools of protection and control. Countries like Germany and the Soviet Union deployed them extensively, especially in rear areas. Their roles were clearly defined. They escorted supply trains, patrolled railway lines, and guarded critical infrastructure. In occupied territories, they were used by Nazis against partisan forces who relied heavily on sabotage and hit-and-run tactics. In this environment, armored trains were extremely effective. They combined mobility along rail lines with concentrated firepower. They could respond quickly to attacks, and they could dominate a specific corridor of terrain. At the same time, their design continued to evolve. Armored trains of World War II were far more advanced than their predecessors. They featured heavier armor, more powerful artillery, and importantly, integrated anti-aircraft defenses. This was a direct response to one of their greatest vulnerabilities, air attack. Because by this stage, air power had become a decisive factor in warfare. Aircraft could strike railways, destroy tracks, and attack trains directly. Unlike ground forces, they were not constrained by infrastructure. This meant that even the most heavily armored train could be neutralized if air superiority was lost. And so armored trains adapted. They became part of a larger defensive system, often operating with anti-aircraft guns and coordinated with other units. But this adaptation did not remove their fundamental limitation. It only reduced the risk. Another important shift was their role in air defense itself. Some armored trains were specifically configured as mobile anti-aircraft platforms, protecting key railway junctions or moving along routes to defend against air raids. In this sense, they became not just users of infrastructure, but defenders of it. And this highlights their true role in World War II. They were not competitors to tanks. They were complements to logistics. Tanks fought for territory. Armored trains ensured that the systems behind those tanks continued to function. This distinction explains why they remained relevant. Because even in a war dominated by mobility and mechanization, victory still depended on supply. And supply depended on railways. But at the same time, the limits of the concept were clearer than ever. Armored trains were powerful, but predictable, effective, but restricted, useful, but never decisive on their own. They could secure a line, they could defend a region, but they could not win a war. And by the end of World War II, this reality was fully understood. Armored trains had found their place, not at the center of the battlefield, but along the lines that made the battlefield possible. After the end of World War II, the role of armored trains changed once again. The era of total industrial war had proven their usefulness in protecting railways and supporting logistics, but it had also exposed their limitations. And in the post-war world, those limitations became even more significant. At first, armored trains did not disappear completely. In the early Cold War, they were still used in certain regions, mostly in internal conflicts or for railway security, but their importance steadily declined. The reason was not that railways became irrelevant. On the contrary, they remained critical for logistics. The problem was that warfare itself had changed. Speed increased, precision increased, and most importantly, reach increased. Weapons were no longer limited by distance or terrain in the same way. Aircraft, long-range artillery, and eventually guided missiles could strike targets far beyond the immediate battlefield. Infrastructure could be targeted directly without the need to physically approach it. And in this new environment, the fundamental weakness of armored trains became impossible to ignore. They were still bound to rails. They could not maneuver freely, they could not disperse, and they followed predictable routes. What had once been an advantage, structured movement along a network, now became a liability in a world of precision strikes. And yet, the idea did not vanish. It transformed into something far more strategic. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union developed systems like RT-23 Molodets, a rail-based intercontinental ballistic missile platform. At first glance, this seems very different from traditional armored trains. There were no visible cannons, no armored turrets, no battlefield presence in the classical sense. But the underlying logic was the same: mobility through infrastructure. The goal was not to fight on the battlefield, but to survive long enough to launch a nuclear strike. Railways offered a vast network across thousands of kilometers, allowing missile trains to move constantly, hide among civilian traffic, and remain difficult to detect. In this sense, the armored train concept reached its most abstract form. It was no longer about firepower in combat. It was about survivability and unpredictability. However, even this version faced growing challenges. Modern surveillance technologies, satellites, electronic intelligence, tracking systems made concealment increasingly difficult. And the rise of highly accurate long-range weapons reduced the advantage of mobility along fixed routes. At the same time, entirely new threats emerged. Precision-guided missiles could strike infrastructure with extreme accuracy. Air power became faster and more flexible. And in recent years, drones have added another layer of vulnerability. Unlike traditional aircraft, drones can loiter, observe, and strike with precision at relatively low cost. For a large, predictable target like a train, this is a serious problem. Destroy the tracks, and the system stops. And this brings us back to the core issue. In modern warfare, flexibility is everything. Systems that can disperse, hide, and move unpredictably across terrain have a clear advantage. Tanks, armored vehicles, and aircraft all operate within this logic. Armored trains do not. They are powerful within a narrow framework, but that framework is now easier than ever to disrupt. This is why today, armored trains are rarely used in their classical form. They may still appear in limited roles: railway security, internal conflicts, or specific operational environments, but they are no longer central to military strategy. And yet, the idea has not completely disappeared. Because as long as railways exist, and as long as there is a need to move something heavy, protected and mobile along them, the concept remains possible. Not dominant, not decisive, but still present. A reminder of a time when infrastructure itself could become a weapon, and of how that idea evolved, adapted, and ultimately reached its limits in the modern world.